Hi everyone, it's me, Tim, and today I want to talk about research, specifically the research that you do when you first start a game. I get a very detailed question on the channel from Lazar Satulovic, who asked, "This might be a very lengthy topic, but I'm interested to hear you talk about the research phase of game development. I have a couple of sub-questions about it. Obviously, research is very important for games that are set in historical settings or games that want to accurately depict real modern day cities. So, how important was research in Fallout, Arcanum, and the Outer Worlds, which aren't tied down that way? Does research only happen during the early stages of development, or does it last throughout production? Can there be additional research during the later stages of production if the need arises? Which are some of the things you personally researched while designing your games? I think you may have touched on this a bit when you talked about FEV." Okay, that is quite the set of questions, and I'm going to try to answer all of them. I even dug up some Arcanum research that I did. So I will get to that. This could be long. Grab some coffee. I'm going to try to answer it in detail because that was a lot of questions and they all deserve an answer. But before I start, let me say what I'm going to assume you mean by research. Actually, no, before I even do that, I'm going to assume you already have a setting. Because remember, I always say it goes, you make a set, you decide on a setting, then you decide on your story, then you decide on your system mechanics. I'm going to assume you've at least picked a setting. Otherwise, you're not really doing you call it research. You're basically casting about for the base idea of your game. Remember, I consider setting to be the first and most fundamental decision you can make. So I'm going to assume you already have a setting. So now you want to do research about that setting. Yes, I do research in the standard way of, going to the library or going online now and reading history, reading about science, facts and science development. But I also include as part of that research books, movies, TV shows, board games, other video games that share that setting that you've decided on, because those can really, really assist you in developing your game, both in what you liked about those things and didn't like. I have a whole video about the influences of that went into Fallout, and I talk about movies and books and TV shows and other games. And some of them, we weren't trying to copy them. There was some element we liked. For example, in A Boy and His Dog, we liked the setting and some of the decisions they made in it. The story was, the dialogue. Road Warrior was a huge influence on how we looked. Not just the setting, we had a very similar setting to Road Warrior and what happened afterwards, but we liked the look. Despite the fact that it kind of implied that after a nuclear war, you not only still had access to hairstylists, but those stylists had access to mousse and hair gel and other hairstyling products. And everybody dressed like they wanted to be fashionable and be about to appear in an 80s Duran Duran video. But we liked that. That was an influence on us. So you don't have to, when you're doing research, you don't have to look for things that are justifiable. You do your research to decide these are the elements of that setting that I love. Maybe I should put them in my game. Now, you may find that you like a lot of things and they're not mutually compatible. So you don't have to put everything you discover in your game. Some things don't belong together. But sometimes the juxtaposition of two things that aren't quite usually juxtaposed, Fallout, 50s and the future, that worked really well for us. So I'm assuming you're doing that kind of research. So many of my games, as you pointed out, were historical offshoots. So Fallout diverged at some point from our history. The Outer Worlds diverged at some point from our actual history. Arcanum was different in that what we did is we took a very Lord of the Rings style fantasy world and then said, boom, it has an industrial revolution. Now, we actually tried to define that, and that's why I actually wrote a document that I found in my many, 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 many notes called Victorian Times. I started writing this in 98. The last time I touched it looks like September 2000. What I did is I even said, this document lists the prevailing social and environmental issues during the Victoria era This era is defined as 1837 through 1901, the reign of Queen Victoria in Great Britain. This era was represented by such 19th century ideals as devotion to family life, public and private responsibility, and obedience to law. The prevalent morals, manners, and tastes have been described as prudish, narrow, pompous, hypocritical, ornate, and eclectic. And Arcanum will explore many of those stereotypes. It goes on for 6-8 pages. It's not a huge document, but what I did was I wrote all these things down so that when we were doing quests and character dialogues and just trying to come up with new locations, people could look at this document and go, this is kind of what we've agreed on are things that happened historically in Great Britain that we wanted to touch on in Great Britain, and I'll go over it. So I talked about coal, not just as a form of power, but also for its use in metallurgical stuff like steel. So it drove engineering developments. Pollution, which I talked about how pollution affected particular trades, where chimney sweeps got cancer of the scrotum. Hatters, often went crazy because they used nerve-destroying mercury salts to treat felt. That's where the phrase Mad Hatter, or Mad as a Hatter, came from. And bootblacks often got liver damage from the solvents they used to polish boots. But then I had a very specific one on air pollution, which really became an issue in 18th and 19th century. And that's when it first became a major problem. People reported issues as early as 1661, but it wasn't until the 1900s that people really, or 1700s through 1800s, that people really started to go, this is becoming a problem. There's a whole section on corsets and their use. And there's a whole section on railroad magnates, which is something we use because we wanted railroads to be a big part of the Arcanum world. There's a section on missionary work, on exploration of parts of the world that weren't known to the Victorians. I talked about fox hunting and ballooning and what roles those had in the world. Talked about boxing and how that was revived in London, and there were prize fights in the 18th century. I talk about catalog ordering, which became a big thing and was being used by people to bypass wholesalers and retailers. And the reason it worked was because of the rise of steamboats and railroads to deliver things. And if you look at a Sears catalog, we actually went to a bookstore and found an old Sears catalog from the very early 1900s. People were ordering houses. You would order a kit that was a put together house that you knew you could do yourself. There were so many things that you could order on mail order catalogs. It was like the Amazon of 1901. We talked about the discovery of fossils and how that was changing science and creating paleontology. Heavier than air flying machines, which were becoming a thing. So ballooning became a pastime, where heavier than air became a transportation network thing. Opera houses, which were very popular in the late 1800s. The construction of dams for power generation and flood control. Photoplays, which were very primitive motion pictures. How schooling worked, what common ailments there were. We looked up grip, consumption, croup, dropsy, pleurisy, and I described what all of those were. Infant mortality, which was surprisingly low, and then soared into the Industrial Revolution. The use of child labor, again, how education worked, labor strikes, and then women's suffrage and women getting involved in politics. These were all things that I wrote historical events for, so people could address them in our game. These were things. Arcanum did a lot of commentary on social things. A lot of people go, well, isn't that being racist or sexist? We were addressing those issues through the lens of a fantasy game. So that was a lot of the research I did for that, and that was done at the very beginning. And yes, I will say that, to answer your question, a lot of research is done before you start. Like, you have the setting, boom, let's do research. So we looked up a lot of stuff about radiation and how big and how much effect nuclear bombs had when we started Fallout. When we did Arcanum, I reread Lord of the Rings. I still reread it occasionally. I love that book. In addition, we did research, like I just pointed out, on the effects of the Industrial Revolution in England, and especially in London. Tarrant was obviously modeled after London. However, we also did a lot of research during the game, because things would come up and we realized we don't really know enough about that, or the research we did before we started is too shallow to support what we want to do. So you have to do, and it could come up for different reasons. Maybe somebody's trying to write a quest and they don't quite understand something, or maybe you have a character who really would talk about something in more detail than you've done in the research. That's when I did a deep dive into microbiology research during Fallout about virions, VIRIONS, because the FEV, there's a microbiology report you could find somewhere that's saying it's not really a virus per se, it's a virion. And I wrote all the stuff I had researched, and that really went in to kind of influencing what FEV was. There was also a book called Elise, A Terrifying Tale of Immortality, about a woman who just happened to be born, instead of with a double helix, she was born with a quadruple helix, and it made her immortal. I kind of took that idea and said, well, what if FEV did that? What if one of the things FEV did was duplicate your helix? Because that would really, really help you in many ways. It would make you radiation resistant, because instead of having to knock out, because if you knocked out one element from a DNA, you still have another strand to know what it got, because everything pairs exactly 1-to-1 on DNA strands. But if you had two double helixes, every time something got lost, you not only had an exact copy of it, but you had two things that confirmed what that copy was. So I said, well, in addition to being longer lived, they should be radiation resistant. And then we said, what if it does other things, like makes you really big and you become a super mutant? I thought goals were radiation. It was something I wish I had written down, but we all disagreed on that, especially where Harold was involved. But I did write a detailed description of how virions worked and how that was for FEV, to the extent that a German microbiologist wrote us after we shipped and said, you guys did a really good job at that description of FEV. So I was like, yeah. This goes back to what I say about lore. I did a video on lore. Sometimes you put things in because most of the people playing the game won't care, and if they do care, they won't even get it. But the right people will get it, as Leonard said. So I think that's everything. I hope that answered all your questions, Lazar. Research is really important. You started early, but you may have to do it in the middle of the game. And research can be anything from looking up scientific and historical facts to watching movies and TV shows, reading books, and playing games of all kinds set in the same setting you're doing, just to see what other people have done and what you like and don't like. Whew. So I hope that answers all the questions you had about research.